So this is supposed to be an intimate roundtable discussion called Growing Pains, Scaling and Re-Architecting Apps Under Fire. The idea here is not that I'm going to give a presentation, but that we're going to try and solution for some of the problems we have that we share. So we're going to be using that mic a lot, and you won't just be asking questions, although you can ask one of the group. You're also going to be sharing some of the things that have worked for you or have not worked for you, and we'll kind of work through those things. So, who am I? My name is Darcey. I, until about 3 weeks ago, led the Android platform team at Reddit. I just left to go off into new adventures, and I'm just back from Alaska. So I start my new thing next month, and this ended up being a really weirdly timed talk. But a whole bunch of people from my previous team are here and over there. And so they'll be representing Reddit. I've also worked in IoT, and I've been working in Android since the beta. My husband and I wrote a whole bunch of Android books really early on, like back in the Eclipse days. So one of the things we really liked about Android was that it was much more democratized than, say, Brew and some of the walled gardens of the earlier days. And that has really panned out over time. We went to the first droidcon in Berlin, and we were just wowed by the different vibe that you got from engineers who work in the Android space. And I think that has continued, and we're at 16 years now of droidcons, and you still get that here. And that has kind of drifted in some of the other conferences, like Google I/O has become much more product-facing and that kind of stuff, but you still get to meet fellow engineers here. So this next 45 minutes is a space for engineers to talk to other engineers. I think the problem we want to really focus on here is true of the smallest to the largest companies. You are always making trade-offs. You are always trying to negotiate technical work onto roadmaps. You are always vying for resources to complete that work. And there are other incentives that your company has, which Stacy talked about in the early keynote of you want to ship features, you want to ship product value. How do you negotiate things that have less obvious product value sometimes or are using a different rubric for it? So on platform teams, we're talking a lot about DevX improvements. We're talking about architectural changes that you need to make. How do you do those when you really have to rebuild the plane in flight? The only teams that are really somewhat temporarily protected from this are the really early startups who are just introducing their first tech debt right now, and that's a slightly different set of problems to solve. So I did come up with a couple of prompts to start us, but if anyone has come to this particular talk to hear a certain question answered, I would really like you to think about what that question is and ask it sooner rather than later at the mic. So I think the way that I will do this is, what are some ways that you decide what to work on? That's a good place to start. I think that one of the things that I take when I was a feature manager or a platform manager was try to end up talking apples to apples. So if you are an agile company, if you're running sprints, make sure that the work that you are talking about trying to get into a given sprint or a given quarterly plan is written in the same language as your product folks. So if they like to talk about epics, and they like to talk about stories, and they like to talk about story points, perhaps, if you can give them a value prop in that sort of format, you're going to be able to negotiate on a much more even scale than to say, I promise if you do this tech debt work, it's going to be great, versus I have this epic that's going to deliver this specific feature that it has a visual aid. You understand what you're trying to give to the users. So that's one of the things that whenever I have had, been lucky enough to have a PM, we usually try and make sure we're talking about the same language no matter what. This also helps us talk to the other teams that we need to convince to do that work. We should be willing to do that work ourselves and stand by the results of it before we go asking any other teams to take that risk. So I'm curious, does anyone here use that approach? Are you using completely different approaches? If you have a migration that you need to do, probably at this point, everyone here has done a Java to Kotlin migration, probably at some point in time. How did you convince your teams to do those pieces of work? Was the value prop there? Can you prove that it was the right thing to do? Anyone want to get up and talk about that? I'm going to call on you if you don't. You're not going to leave me hanging up here the whole time. Or maybe you will. That was actually a really interesting one for us at Reddit. It is kind of hard to explain why a language migration is valuable. I think a lot of teams, including my team at Vivint, what we did was, it was a Boy Scout rule for a long time. If you touched a file, convert it. If it's not too hard, just go and do it. Basically, get as far along with kind of a natural, organic migration as possible. And that works to a point. However, one of the things I learned in that time was having interop for a lot of these migrations really helps start them, but it makes them go longer because you can live in the interim world somewhat comfortably for a really long time and not finish things. And it turns out that can be a problem when those start to add up. It also means when you want to go, I don't know, take on a new compiler or something, and you might not be able to take advantage of all the features that you might have wanted to, which means you're not even realizing the value of having moved to Kotlin because you're stuck with all of the legacy stuff coming along for the ride. Another challenge we faced in that particular area was, in the end, the last mile of that problem, and it's really hot up here, sorry. You think that they're all equally difficult to do, these migrations. But it turns out that these things sort themselves out so that the last mile is usually the most dicey things, that people didn't touch them and didn't do them for a reason. And you might not even really understand why until you try and go do them and you cause an incident. And that can actually completely undermine this was a really good migration to do. And really at the last moment when you're trying to actually land it. And we had a few of those happen where there were surprises in we had our main activity was still sitting in Java until the absolute very end, and a couple people tried and had to revert it back. So we got really good at planning how we were going to touch those specific files, making sure nothing was happening at the time, making sure we had a revert plan, a lot of extra testing. But it was important for us to do those things, and it really wasn't clear until after why. So developers loved working in Kotlin, still do. So the DevX was really easy, but that's really hard to actually give a value to. Your execs aren't really usually that interested in the developer love of the language because they hear about that constantly, and it's always the next one. But what helped us was things like nullability. We didn't have nearly as many foot guns. We weren't having to do hot fixes on certain types of crashes. So we led with the stability story. And then we went with a brevity story of the cognitive load of looking at these things is less. And we also ended up tying it into, we had 0 test coverage doing this migration at the beginning. So it was really obnoxious to basically have no safety net. So it was, well, if you're going to do this migration, you better end up with testable code at the end of it. So you tag on the testable part of that thing. So what we found was the first migration was somewhat naive, a lot of just auto conversions and then some very careful migrations of dicey stuff. But we didn't declare success. We did have cake at the end of that, the actual migration, but we didn't really declare success until we did the fast follows. So what were those? Once you were in a Kotlin space, you should actually be able to justify all the reasons you went there. And you might not have realized them right off the bat. For example, We did not switch everything over to coroutines all at once. We had brought over a whole bunch of RxJava with us, but we decided, hey, the coroutines part adds a lot of value to this. It becomes a sort of fast follow migration of now we want to all go coroutines first and get rid of all of our other ways in which we were solving that problem. So we continue to condense into having a single way of doing things. Things like data classes were something that had, some of these things actually didn't show up in the first part of Kotlin and came later in Kotlin. And so you adapt those things as you find that they are actually providing better value. As a platform team, we also looked at all the tooling that suddenly we were able to actually adopt the newer tooling much faster, which helped our build times, which made everyone happy. So if you can tie those things together, you kind of get people trusting that you're not just doing something because there's hype. You're not just doing something because it's the thing everyone else is doing. You have to justify it with the build time numbers, the developer velocity numbers that you can get out of it. Some of the time, you can get really great hard numbers for those things and actually put a monetary value on them. And some of the times, you have to go with anecdotal stories from a team and use that to convince other teams to start doing those same things. And then the last thing I'll say, and then Samaya is going to ask us a new question, hopefully, is this is also helping prepare for the AI future in our space. The more you consolidate your code base and have a single set of styles and patterns, the more quickly you are going to be able to adapt and influence how your code base is reshaped as we see what's going on next. So you can possibly get a lot farther, a lot faster with the tools we have in front of us. And I think that is pretty interesting because we've spent a lot of time trying to boilerplate stuff on purpose. That means we can manipulate it in ways that we've never been considered before. And so the more you take a very very long legacy layered tech stack set of choices that you've had for possibly many years, and you consolidate it down to a few patterns, you will be able to have the kind of benefits that you usually only see in greenfield work or startups that catch up with the people who have had a company for a while. And that's something that I've never seen in my career of usually you have to either burn the whole thing down, which no one ever wants to really do and often fails, or you're going to have your lunch eaten by some new startup that doesn't have the baggage going along that you do. All right, that's my lunch spiel. What do we got here? Your turn.
Is this working? Okay. You actually covered the topic that I wanted to dive into, which is how do you tell that story about aligning a lot of this engineering investment work that's often seen as a cost or a drag on your business goals, which is usually around getting to market with a bunch of features or capturing a new market segment. How do you find yourself telling that story to make this work happen to non-engineering folks?
Great question. And I think I just lost my mic, but we're going to keep talking. How do we tell the story, including to non-engineering folks, right?
Yes.
That's the question? Okay. That's actually one of our interview questions, too. So I love this question. I think you have to tell the story differently to different people. It is very important, and this is a coaching thing for our ICs. They often want to talk about what's good about it for them. So when they're talking amongst each other, it's really easy to get alignment on, we should go do this work. You all understand it. You all understand the incentives. They are in your favor. You want it for your reasons. But when you're selling, you have to sell to the person that is on the other side of that equation. And so when you're, a good example of this is when you want to introduce a design system, your designers might not want that up front. They might like having their little areas where they get to actually influence very strongly and not have to align with each other. But every time they ask for a rebrand, if you're giving them an estimate that is ridiculously large because of all the nuance all over your surfaces, you make sure you include, how we keep asking for that design system, my number would have been way lower if you'd let us do that first. And maybe we'll do this one rebrand, and then you'll let us do that, so the next one will be cheaper. And if you say that enough times, and you stick around enough times, you will get that sort of buy-in usually, because estimates are really like the way in which you negotiate a lot of things. So I can make my estimate a lot better if you let me do this first. Or if you let me do this, it's a fast follow. So, because I know you're going to rebrand again in like 18 months, just like clockwork, it just happens. But executives, I have found it's all over the place in how you tell that story. They all have different incentives and desires, and they're not always about the bottom line. So if you have a engineering director that is like a former engineer from that particular team, they may have specific areas that they have like strong feelings about, and if you are addressing those things, or if they're hearing about incidents they're constantly having in a space, you tie it into, we're not going to have that kind of incident anymore if we do this work. And so that is a very tangible thing, and I am very, like, I've gotten through many projects by just bringing a stack of postmortems in which I just went to those postmortems and went, would this have happened if we'd had this? And the answer is no, and it's on the record, and then just you bring the stack, and the stack gets taller, and eventually the stack is enough. They're like, I feel like we have enough receipts here to really justify this on the incident load alone. What else? I think that if you, one of the things we do to sell is you never make something bigger than it needs to be. This is really hard. I see that I think I gave a talk about this a while ago, of like, I've seen two types of migrations. The ones where none of the payload is there until the very end. That takes a lot of faith that you're going to land it and it's going to work the way you expected it to. But there's another kind where if you can figure out how to break it down, where you can do it incrementally and you can stop along the way, and you get partial results. Our modularization strategy falls into this, where the more teams we got out and modularized, they went off happily. The ones who were left behind were continuing to be somewhat miserable. And we're like, look over there. If you actually follow the prescription, you're going to be a lot more isolated. You're going to have really fast local build times. You're not going to be running into that guy broke that thing over there, and their tests are all over your stuff. And so you can basically speak to what are their pain points, and you have to understand them. I've always been pretty lucky in having like engineering leadership around me that was engineering focused, and I think I've gravitated in that direction anyway, and so it's a little easier to make the case there. Some other ways, I've definitely leveraged the security aspect sometimes. If you have enough security incidents, you just go make sure that the security team is on your side on some of those things, and like they can help you convince the business to do something that may seem a little bit like tangential because of the risks associated with those security types of situations. So I think that has been helpful with changing vendors sometimes. If you have a vendor that is just like a little bit wobbly and you want to move to a situation that is a little more stable, you can use that approach too. Let's have another one.
Okay, you put in a lot of hard work to trim scope of your migration. You've got broad alignment in your organization that this work is important, but you have a lot of engineers working on the project. How do you help guide and steward the project so that that migration doesn't turn into a budget for everyone's pet projects that are kind of adjacent to?
Oh boy. So I think I've learned a lot of hard lessons in this space. I'll give you an example of where it went horribly wrong. Although I think that most people think it was a success, I would never take the same approach again. I had some executive leadership who wanted to do a really, really big tech stack migration. And it involved what was under the hood like 30 different migrations, but on multiple platforms. But they really wanted like a brand for this and a tagline and it's just the blah, blah, blah migration, the super cool tech stack migration, or we'll just give it a really great name. And I didn't love this idea, but I knew that was the only way that they would ever want, that's the level they wanted to talk about it, which is important for them to have that tool. But by doing that, you packaged what was so much stuff that you couldn't fit it all into your head. It was hard to sell what the value of it was because it was a laundry list of things that was happening at different rates. Different teams needed to do different parts of it because they were at completely different places. So it was really nice shorthand in the beginning. But what happened over time was the teams that did the work early on stayed really close to the original alignment. And the ones that took their time and used it as a menu picked and chose the parts that they liked about the migrations, did those, and then they'd like scope creep in some things that had nothing to do with the migrations that they wanted to do under the broad hood of that term and said, we're doing this too. And I'm like, but that has nothing to do with the actual prescription that we give, which means it has nothing to do with the outcomes that we promised. And when those types of things would go sideways, we would have to explain why, like, a good example of this is we were doing a REST to GraphQL migration that had nothing to do with server-driven UI or protobufs or anything, and suddenly that is part of it. And I'm like, no, just do the we had a very clear latency gain if all you did was move over, and we had promised that latency gain, the latency improvements. But when you add all this other stuff in there and then package it under the same name, it actually caused the brand to be messed with for a while, and we had to explain that a lot. What I do think works, a couple things. I had a really great platform team that they were really good owners of the individual parts. Drew is a great example of somebody who totally owned the DI answer for Android for the entire company. And so you have somebody who basically is a high-touch support for anything that you need to be doing in that space. He had Slack channels, he had documentation, he was running guild meetings that were going over these things. He would do our hack weeks. He was always available doing little migrations for people that could only do tech at work during hack weeks, which is a terrible thing to have to rely upon, but a fact of life in some companies. So I think that having really strong ownership of the spaces works really well for aligning across many, many engineers and having a single source of truth of what you're supposed to be doing. Golden examples worked really well for us. Other things that worked well for us, we integrated platform teams to guild meetings. We made sure even our contractors could go to guild meetings. If you're trying to explain a pattern and you need everyone to be following that same pattern, it doesn't make a lot of sense to only tell your full-time workers and not your contractors. They're all contributing to the same code base, so you have to figure out how to make that a place that information is regularly distilled. So that worked really well for us too. High psychological safety Slack channels where you can ask anything and nobody's going to give you any sort of shit about it. I don't know. You guys think about what other things worked. You can get up and suggest. What didn't work? Maturity models. They tried. It was a complete disaster trying to do a maturity model, which is basically a Excel matrix of every team and everything they needed to do and track it. And the TPMs tried to do this, and it was just use source graph, follow, and reduce the problem that way. It was much easier. I hope that helps. All right, next.
I've been in a situation a couple of times. You mentioned that there are two ways. You either do it all together or you do it by steps. By steps has been by far the most effective that I've seen, but I've reached out points where we start seeing gains and then we assume that we're done. How do you get buy-in to finish what you started, even though you can show that there's still work to be better, but how do you show that it's not good enough?
Right. Reddit is famous for this. They end up with 10 different platforms doing parts of the big picture, and they 10% on each for a bit. How did we solve that? We definitely juggled a lot of migrations at the same time. But we would focus OKR, KPI, quarterly goals on something that we could finish that quarter. So we would usually have a few that were within striking distance of the end, and we would call our shots on those when we would get, there'd be the organic part of the project that kind of like moves along at whatever speed it's moving. We would watch those things to make sure that we weren't growing the good thing we wanted and the bad thing we wanted at the same time. So we learned to track the legacy method and the new method of whatever we were suggesting on the same graph, because you want to see one going up and one going down. And sometimes if you are not paying attention, they are both going up, because people are copy pasting all the old stuff in the old places and making it worse, and they are adopting the new stuff in the new place and making it better. We would look for that nice type of graph. And if we didn't see it, we would start introducing friction on the thing we didn't want. We would make sure everyone knew that that was going away. If you wanted the high-touch support, you needed to start thinking about going in the new way. We were explaining the value of that. Why do it this way? Like, you don't like talking about Dagger and you don't like talking about DI, but like if you do it this way, it's going to be a lot simpler for you. Everyone who's done it has said it wasn't as painful as they thought it was going to be. It only took a day, that kind of thing. But when you get within the end, either you would rally everyone to try and finish it, and you would do that by any positive means possible. So memes, special pledges, haikus, anything that you need, like help you write your staff promo doc, like whatever works. And then sometimes a smaller group of people would actually just decide to beast mode and kill it off. So we would often have a few of those around, and I really hope RxJava is the next one on the list. It was so close last month. But if you do not do those, at some point in time you have to start saying, I can't add another migration until we finish that one. And that's really hard to say to your team, but if you don't finish those things, the thing that really happens is the cognitive load in annoying update meetings and what's the state of things gets so long with a whole bunch of noise that you're like, well, you're 83% done with this and 73% done with this. Like, if you actually kill stuff off, you start having a really concrete, concise conversation about just the thing you want to be doing. So once you get into this pattern of reducing things down to a smaller number of things, then you really want to just keep it there and have your current, and ideally your legacy is going away so fast that you have the opportunity to run at the next thing, because you can't do that if you're dragging along a whole bunch of half-finished projects with you. Yeah, that'd be my answer.
Thanks, Lauren. Also, congrats on the almost RxJava migration. So we have a storytelling problem with regards to app performance. It seems as though we have to really convince non-tech folk at the company that app performance is important. And we've been trying to figure out different ways of tying it to business KPIs, but it never really works out, and we're never able to create a believable story. So it's resulted in this fragmented approach to solving our performance issues, where people, if they have time between projects, they might tackle some things. Do you have any advice for how to go about that?
I have a really mixed set of feelings about performance. I think that you can go on faith when your performance problems are extremely bad. A good example of this is if your app startup time is in the 12-second range at P90, even your tests take forever. It's like you don't even have to go talk about your product people might say they only launch it once a day. Like, that's not such a big deal, right? It's like, well, there are millions of them, and it's way outside the norm of what is expected in our at our level of app or class or whatever. But you can also just go and say the test cost is I can give you a dollar amount and just give me that much to go fix that sort of a problem. The bigger the problem, though, also the easier it is to bring it down into a fairly reasonable range. I love those types of projects, the ones where you're cutting off a ridiculous amount of tech debt fast. I have a much harder time, even myself, arguing a small latency gain unless I can prove that it's in a bottleneck space. And that is, we've gotten better at doing that over time in our industry, and also the frameworks are getting, Ben Weiss has been doing some amazing work in this, and he's constantly making it easier and easier for all of Android developers to go benchmark stuff. But there's no point in having an amazing performance improvement in a place that doesn't matter. And it's the more we have sharded things out and are using parallelization, the harder it is to know what's the long pole. And so those are they're harder. And you often have to fall back on meta studies. I have the same problem with APK size. The white paper from 2017 has not held up. Google won't redo it. And I'm like, well, stop taking that advice. You can, in your head, you can understand that millions of people downloading an app that is bigger is going to have some downsides, but you don't really have the ability to quantify that at a DAU level or a growth level or anything like that in a really, really clear way, which is what people want. The easiest way I found with performance was literally go mine the user feedback for all the people screaming about it. And I'm like, I can pull thousands of people in every release that are upset about this. And if we do care about their happiness, maybe we should listen to them and just resolve these things even if we can't measure them very well. Yeah, it's mine.
Okay, I have another question around, I'm curious, has anyone successfully created a culture of post-mortems for engineering projects like migrations? So I'm going to tell a quick story, and I hope I'm not violating any company policies here, but we do postmortems for SEVs. I know a lot of companies do this. It's kind of standard practice. And so we basically try to learn when we make a really big public mistake. But I think migrations are very silent mistakes sometimes. They can go way too long, or they go wildly out of scope, or they just go in the wrong direction sometimes. And I'd like to build a culture of learning from that, because often the only people who remember how badly that went are the senior folks, and it's kind of institutional knowledge. So yes, so have you ever done a postmortem for an engineering-driven project, and how did that go?
Yeah. Yes. So I am a huge fan of blameless postmortem culture. I like pre-mortems. These are the things you do before you even do a project, and you think about what's going to go wrong and how you can possibly get in front of it. A good example of that is we had finished one migration. We pre-mortemed the next one just very lightly. It was a casual conversation in which we went, everyone was running into CI checks that were useless for their migration. And so we wrote a workaround for bypassing all of those checks. As long as you were only doing the migration that we suggested, you could basically get an easy mode around a lot of the other things that were getting in your way. And then we reverted that when we were done and said, people were on their best behavior with that use. If we ran into trouble, we would postmortem that. But we never had to. So there have been times where we have relaxed rules, especially after we've been we just keep hitting these. Sometimes you don't recognize them until you have the postmortem about that, or you're watching along the way really carefully to see what's getting in people's way, and you adjust that as you go. But you normally use a postmortem to kind of formalize those things into better processes for the next time. One of the things I was originally planning on prompting people on was a lot of our migrations have gone better when we rethought why some of our safeties were in place in the first place. And this is one where you have to have a high trust team that is willing to own the results of backing off a check or a safety. But a good example of this is at one point we realized that the Android repo at Reddit had extra reviewers compared to the iOS repo. And the reason was because we had more contractors. And there was this lack of trust at the time that rule was set up. But we also had a lot less good PR review behavior when that was introduced. And so we said, we're going to actually back that out. We'll go to what everyone else at the company has. And if we're wrong, we can always reintroduce it. It's not difficult. But we'll just watch it and see if we actually, if that's a foot gun or not. And it wasn't. It was fine. Everyone, things just moved that much faster because you were not fishing for reviews that didn't matter. Did the same thing with cherry picks, late merges, things like that. Your migrations go better when there's not excessive test coverage requirements on things that don't need it yet, those types of things. Or a type of test that doesn't actually matter to the type of thing you're doing, but is forced via a PR check. So negotiating around those instead of somebody thinking that they have to solve everything at once when you don't have to. But if you are not using postmortems, there's almost no better process I can think of in engineering than a good postmortem. I'm not saying that I've seen really great ones. I've seen them go south plenty of times, but if you enter into them with the idea is you want to talk about what went wrong on purpose, you're not pointing fingers, and you want to come out of that with action items you actually plan on doing something about, they can be extremely powerful. Yeah.
Right. Small question about migrations. So, well, first of all, about migrations. You mentioned a situation with that large main activity that had to be sort of you had to try a couple of different approaches before you finally managed to convert it to Kotlin. Is that right?
It was one of the final ones we had to commit, yeah.
Yeah. We've got some kind of complicated situation like that at my company. What ended up being the approach that really worked for taking a big life cycle component that's tied in and turning it into actually manageable code?
So it's a good question. You boil down the problems as much as you can so that you can actually just distill the one thing that is going to be hard to manage. I think that we don't just have this with migrations, we have this with major dependency updates and other things where it's there's a good chance that you're not going to get the entire thing right the first time. And I approach those things from what's the worst that can happen? This is a kind of a pre-mortem sort of thing, but if the worst case scenario is we have to revert it and hotfix it, then maybe don't spend all of exhaustive amount of time trying to control the situation so much as detect the fact that you've screwed it up really, really fast and revert the problem really, really fast and learn that way. So I don't like it when you have people that I want to load test in production and I'm just going to turn it up to find all the bugs. It's not what I'm talking about. But what I am talking about is when you've done the normal or slightly more than normal amount of due diligence, it's sometimes better to just fail fast than it is to try and figure out where you're going to find the problem when it's too complicated of a problem to actually figure that out in advance. Especially, we regularly had things where they're not testable, they're not gateable. Platform teams have this a lot, where it's just I had numerous conversations with our quality engineering folks who are can you just gate all of these compose dependency updates, or can you gate your APK size changes? And I'm no. And we're not going to. We're going to follow good practices, review them carefully, and then put an extra person on call that day and watch for the first couple of hours that you go into prod and be absolutely sure that if we need to stop the rollout, we just do that. And it's not considered a bad thing. It automatically triggers a postmortem. And in that postmortem, to Samaya's point, my two favorite things to ask in postmortems, other than the things I already mentioned, is there a test that we could write that would have helped us avoid this problem in the shift left sort of way? And the other one is just, could we have detected this faster? And do we want to operationalize any of the things that we did for similar shaped problems? So instead, a lot of people go into a postmortem and they just try and solve the exact thing that happened and they think they're done. I like to go in and be hey, this kind of problem could happen in a Kotlin migration, it could happen in this, that, or the other type of migration too. What is the general answer to this that we could apply such that we have a flight checklist for that next one? And so your migrations should just keep getting easier the more migrations you do, which is why we got through so many of them as fast as we did. All right, I think we are at time, and sorry this wasn't the round table we were hoping for, but you got to watch me cook on stage instead. All right, bye.